here.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah.
Scott, I'm so glad to have you here. By the way, I've got to tell you and everybody else that supposedly this bench has been sat on by everybody who's anybody in the history of comedy.
I took a picture before this all started, and that's already out on Twitter and Instagram.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
My big moment. Although I will tell you, when I was notifying my team of talented writers and editors and producers, I translated it to Eastern time, and I said, I'm on it at 4:20, and I work for a company called TheBlazes.
Ah.
And I'm in a comedy store. He's like, they weren't sure what I was exactly doing. But it's all okay.
Just for the record, I don't get it.
Okay, all right.
Scott, let's start at the beginning. Define the Blaze. The Blaze is such an interesting animal, and I think by any reasonable expectation, one would assume that it shouldn't exist. And yet it does, and it does really well. So what is the Blaze? I mean, what is it? Why is it as big as it is?
Let me go before I answer that and say, what's the part of you that says it shouldn't exist?
Here's the part that says, okay, this element, exists. This element exists. This element exists. And yet you all put it all together, and it's just huge.
It's magic. That's it. No, the Blaze is almost 5 years old. In fact, I started at the Blaze. I was employee number 1 exactly this week, 5 years ago. And I think our mission and objective, and I think all companies should know why they exist and the unchanging reasons why they're distinctive. And we really came to be because we wanted to kind of be in that zeitgeist for the center to right in this country and to really tell the stories that would drive the discussion. And those stories are digital, they're television, they're audio, they're all of those things, and we know our audience. And I think that's why I was dead wrong. I was a TV news anchor for 20 years, and I had gone digital, and I had a big story in 2004 on Drudge, and I got in with Drudge and Breitbart, and I later co-owned and co-founded Breitbart TV, and I thought I knew everything about the internet after a couple of years of this. I'd had 700 or 800 stories on Drudge, and so when I first joined Glenn's team, I kind of projected that we would kind of just me, 2 other people, we'd do maybe 2 to 4 million page views in the first month. That was my projection. We did 2 million page views the first day, and it just never stopped. And it was because I think we found that our readers, and I kind of put myself as a reader. I don't say, here's our audience and here's us. We are the audience. We just did a site that we would like. We did broadcasts and shows that we would like, and we found that there's a lot of people out there that like those stories and those shows.
Now let's talk about the platform, because audio is a piece of it. Audio isn't all of it, and I wonder if there's not something to be learned by people. In radio, very often, radio and even online radio and even podcasting, there's a desire to live in a silo. Right? I'm in the podcasting space, I'm in the radio space, I'm in the online radio space. There's not a lot of horizontal thinking across those spaces, but you've brought together lots of things across platforms, and I wonder what kind of lesson there is in that for people who think of their vertical as vertical.
Right. Well, I think some of that really goes to working with a master broadcaster and storyteller like Glenn, for whom radio was central. And I remember at the very beginning, he really, envisioned when he first, kind of went into talk radio, that radio would be at the center and there would be later other aspects, but all drive back to that audience on radio. And I think was true for Glenn, for Mercury Radio. For the Blaze, we kind of were able to kind of say, all right, we're coming in with a totally blank slate here. And we knew that the Blaze, even though it started just as a website property, was always going to be more than that. So from the beginning, it was designed to be, we're going to have a television component, we're going to have an audio component, there'd be print components, live events, all of those other things. So it was kind of in our DNA. Our CEO, Betsy Morgan, had been the CEO of the Huffington Post, and obviously Huffington Post does a lot now in non-digital space in terms of broadcasting and whatnot. But when she was a Huffington, she was, it just wasn't in our DNA. Television, video, that was audio, radio, broadcasting came from that world, right? And so my first jobs were in radio, and I never look at it and say I graduated from radio to television and graduated from television to digital. To me, that's all part of one, warp and woof. And we all have stories, and it was fun watching all of that. But I'm that kid I got to when I was in 6th grade. My parents put me in a Christian school outside of D.C., and we had to drive 30 miles each way to get to school and back, and my mom would drive, and we'd listen to WMAL radio in Washington. So for years, would listen to Hardin and Weaver in the morning and Trumbull and Core in the afternoon. And then later, my first internship in broadcasting was at WMAL, and I got to work with all of those guys. And so that, to me, is still, the exciting part of it. And I can go back, and you did overnights in the studio in Baltimore where Arthur Godfrey used to broadcast, and I was a producer at the Voice of America. And we can all have our favorite radio experiences and shows, and remember staying up late at night and dialing in those AM stations. But it's the golden age now, right? I mean, I listen to more spoken word and audio content, both on regular radio, satellite radio. I still go to AM radio.
Well, tell me what you mean by that. You say it's the golden age now. What do you mean?
I just mean I consume more, right? And as an audio consumer, I think than I ever did, right? I get up. If I'm shaving, brushing my teeth, my iPad is playing audio for me while I'm getting ready in the morning. Usually I'm having it just read the Bible to me, right? And then I'm listening to our shows, and I can tell you about the many Blaze shows we do, and 4 million downloads a month that we're doing on our podcast. But when I get onto a plane now, when I was flying out here, my friend Tim Ferriss has a very popular podcast, and so I'm listening on the flight to him interviewing Rick Rubin in Rick Rubin's sauna, like where they have to pause every 15 minutes to douse themselves in ice. Right, and I'm like, this is just fantastic, right? And I'm going back to AM radio. Salem just gave my friend Eric Metaxas a 2-hour talk show that's on a bunch of stations, on an AM station in Pittsburgh. I listen to that. I download that podcast. And then we obviously at the Blaze have the full complement of both live shows, and Glenn's show is a little bit popular. And plus we do lots of streaming content, and I think 26 or 27 different broadcasts a week, and I think 60 different hours of downloadable content a week.
But there's a lot of stuff out there that tries to, there are a lot of brands that say we're going to be media companies and we're going to go across platform, right?
Right.
There's a lot of that out there. How is it that you crack the code?
I think a lot of that really is knowing and being your audience, right? And I see in the conservative space a lot of good and worthy competitors, and I see a lot of people that I just feel like they not only don't know the audience, they probably have a little bit of contempt for the audience. There are lots of Facebook pages out there that appeal to conservatives or whatnot. Those people have Justin Bieber sites and Kim Kardashian sites, and they're just throwing up words to try and get the click to that story. But people know, they understand the nuance, right? They understand the nuance of how if I were a radio or audio pretender, and I probably don't fit quite the bill of many of those in the room, but you would ferret me out in 10 seconds. It's like he's just a poser. Same thing happens with people that talk to conservative audiences, whether it's political audiences, faith audiences, and I think we kind of live in that space, know those people, and are able to say, what stories need to be told, what's not being told, what truths are not being revealed, and then can we do those news stories, can we do those analysis and commentary pieces, can we do podcasts, can we do television shows that reflect that? So we have, we have a 24/7 television network that's on dozens of cable operations around the country, on satellite, and we have a couple 100,000 subscribers OTT, and so huge business on the broadcasting end, but really so much of it drives from the digital content that we put out, just a small, tight news team that says, we gather every morning kind of looking at the stories that we have, what other people are doing, and say, what really matters? What's going to really be the stories that drive the discussion? And if you're there, the audience, like I told you, they came by manifolds more than I expected in that first month.
How do you deal then with the reality we often hear about? Well, this is clickbait. We're creating titles that are designed to be clicked on, and it's really all about the title. It's not about the content. How do you deal in that world? Because that world does affect you in some way, right?
Well, I always say that every story, every broadcast deserves its widest, best potential audience, right? And so a headline, whether it's a name of a show or a title or a segment of a show, or whether it's a digital news story, that's its fighting chance to get you to read that story. Now, none of us like clickbait per se, and mostly when it doesn't pay off, right? And I think that's the biggest thing. If you do a lively headline that entices me and then makes me more satisfied when I click on it than I thought I was going to be, then that's a good thing, right?
Yes.
Then you've done a service. And we say to our writers and to our producers all the time, would you listen to this show? Would you read this story? If you wouldn't read, then would we write that story? We shouldn't, right? So, and if you put the time and effort to produce that show, to write that story, well, then don't you want people to act? They don't owe us anything, right? Mm-hmm. We have to compel them. I always remember my friend Wayne Friedman, who was a TV reporter in San Francisco, always said, he's like, I'm always having to remind myself that the person that's cooking dinner, reading the paper, dealing with the kids, they don't even care that the TV's on, right? Mm-hmm. I'm over there saying, hey, but watch me. Same thing, that works with the headline. So for us, headlines, particularly in the digital world and the news world, variety is really important there, and I think being very kind of not stuck in one model. Sometimes we have very short headlines, sometimes very long headlines, sometimes there's a little curiosity factor there, sometimes they're very blunt and straightforward.
You said to me it started with kind of the mission based, so you're more mission based than you are channel-based, so to speak. Can you talk about that for a sec?
Well, I think I got to go up to the Facebook headquarters recently with Glenn, right? And I've spent time at the Facebook office in New York as well. Facebook, important to digital publishers, although we get a lot of front page traffic, we get a lot of traffic from our email, from other referrals. Facebook's still important. And what was interesting to me was, Facebook can say, and they began their meeting, and maybe they do all of them, saying, these are the 6 things that are incredibly distinctive about Facebook, right? Mm-hmm. These things don't change. And yet we know, and they said, when that light bulb moment for Facebook happened, where they decided in a 1-quarter period that they were a mobile company, right? That Zuckerberg was able to take a massive operation and really pivot them and say, and within 90 days were they the same company? Yes, they were but they had a much different focus. And so I do approach it saying, as long as you know why you exist, and that's an unchanging thing for us, and why you know what your sort of core distinctives are, and those are unchanging things for us. And some, they may be different for different organizations. I mean, for us, for example, skepticism is a very high value, right? Mm-hmm. And we see that as a service, particularly in the conservative sphere, that there's a lot of memes that go around and things that entice people, get them to click, get them angry, and you're like, hey, yes, that's not true. That's not true, right? So what we don't do at The Blaze, we don't get into blogger wars, really beating up this other person, but we'll say, that story that your uncle sent you or your brother-in-law sent you, here's why let's check that one out. Let's debunk that one. Let's rumor check that one. Mm-hmm. So skepticism, and I would say it's sort of friendly cousin curiosity, are a big part of how we do it. Every day, we're always saying, is that true? Is that true? Check that out. Make an additional call. Mm-hmm. Whether we have an original story or a curated story, all stories should be original and add some element to it. And skepticism and curiosity are big factors. So those things don't change. But then when you look out at the I sort of ascribe to that strategic anchor thing, which can be, hey, if Facebook can pivot and become mobile in 90 days, I might have to pivot. Because we are in industries, as Lencioni says, where if you build nuclear power plants and there's a high barrier of entry and a low rate of innovation, that's one model. Well, let's see, in digital news, anybody can start a website, right? Yeah. And there's a high rate of innovation. That means that nimbleness and alacrity are like absolutely essential in that sort of world, right? Mm-hmm. And so I look at those and say, at The Blaze, that becomes essential. So if we're saying we're skeptical and we're curious, but we move at a high speed and with a lot of alacrity, but you can be skeptical and curious, and you can be fast and still be sloppy or bad or whatever. So that level of virtuosity of execution, those things don't change for us. Everything else, whether you're saying, wait, where are we digitally right now? What's happening with mobile? What's happening with Facebook? What's happening with Pinterest? And then when you go to the online world, what's happening with OTT? Where are we with what's happening in cable? What's happening in the podcast world? What's happening with the streaming world? All of those things are part of that mix. And look, it's part of the reason I used to work as a TV anchor for a major broadcasting corporation, or media empire, and about the time that I was leaving, the president of the news division was like, "Well, we're not going to have our anchors and reporters, blogging and all of this. This is really destructive." And I did a live webcast that they thought was going to get 1,000 people, and it got like 40,000 people. This is like 2005 or 2006, and they're like, well, let's keep doing that, right? And the company was like, well, let's study it for a year. And then they never did it, right? And I was like, we can try it. We don't have to build buildings to do this stuff. It's not like you run a factory and you got to build another factory. It's like we can try all kinds of things and see what works, right? And in that sort of process, you're working with the audience to kind of make them, they're part of that, and they certainly are at the Blaze.
This relates to a question I was going to ask you, which is, you're into a lot of areas. You talk about OTT and radio, audio, video, television. How do you make choices? I mean, everybody's dealing with finite constraints, even you.
Yes.
How do you make the choices between all these things that you can experiment with?
Well, I do think that you have to kind of, that's where sort of rigorous self-awareness and self-assessment, even as an organization, is important. What are we really good at, right? And we're fortunate that we have in these areas excellent broadcasters. Mm-hmm. We have excellent people on, obviously even our longtime head of sales, Craig Kitchen, came obviously out of the radio world. Dom Theodore, who runs Blaze Radio now, very experienced in those areas. They know way more. Dom, I spent an hour on the phone with him yesterday. He knows way more about many of these things than I ever will, right? So if you have a good team, right, if you have the people that have those things, then you can make in that group the discussions that are going to move you and give your company the best chance for success. Mm-hmm. And there's no guarantee, obviously, of any of these things. We have challenges, competitive challenges, marketplace challenges, just like all of you do every single day. And so but it's fun solving those problems. I had a 4-hour meeting last night with one of our head of product who lives out here, and you end the 4 hours and you're like, well, we need about another 40 hours. There's a lot to get done.
Okay, if I come from the audio space
Sure.
the way Glenn's show comes from the audio space originally, what advice do you have for someone who comes from that space and is in 2015 and beyond trying to figure out where it's going to go from here? I mean, do I have a podcast? Do I start OTT? I mean, how do I invest my resources, my time, and my attention going forward? What's your advice?
When you think about even I'll use just the audio example for the podcast and things that we do on our program, because we obviously air Glenn's program, and we have programs that stream, and we also have programs that are just download only. We have a new one that's going to come out on Saturday. David Clark, the Milwaukee Sheriff, who you probably often see as a guest on Fox News, will be doing and I haven't even heard the first episode. And I heard it, like, by the end, you're like, boy, this guy is really good. But we have a show called 40 Acres and a Fool that Cam Edwards does about rural life. We have a show by Brian Lilly in Canada. We have Matt Walsh, who is a blogger who gets a lot of provocative attention, not only writes for the site on our contributor space, but does his podcast. We have a really wide range of people that are on our podcast download, but voice is important, right? Obviously, and you all know this, that talent just doesn't appear around every corner, and probably every person in America that thinks they should have a podcast probably does not need a podcast, right? So
That's putting it nicely.
Yeah, right. But we also like surprising people too, because we have Andrew WK, who's kind of an unconventional choice, does a podcast for us, the wild party rocker philosopher, guy from New York, and that show just started a few weeks ago. But having not only looking for talent and looking for people that have a unique perspective, something unique to say, and then we can have people like Dom, who I mentioned, who can then shepherd and cultivate those ideas is very helpful, right? And so we're fortunate that we have a lot of resources to bring to that. But I don't think that's even that's a great advantage for us. But then you have a guy like my friend Tim Ferriss, it's a one-man show, right? It's just Tim kind of being like, all right, here's my thing, and I'm going to go into Rick Rubin's sauna, and he did a 2-hour show with Glenn just down by the water in San Francisco, and he's able to get a huge audience that listens to that and listens to it like I do all the way through, right? Like I use that on planes, a lot of the time. I think that's a really exciting thing, and I would say, and that's why part of my saying that golden age for spoken, word.
But the lesson of that is what?
I think it may be different for different people. In fact, Tim is a great writer, and he probably wasn't a natural broadcaster. He does have a television show that's the #1 series on iTunes, right now. But his thing was it's long form and deep, and and his show notes are really long, right? And so he's saying. And whether it's his show or other shows or shows that we've heard on our network, I've probably, I would say, in the last year, probably have made more changes in my life or had ideas that influenced me, both as a manager, as a broadcaster and writer myself, but also as a person, as a father, probably more than anything based on audio programs that I've heard, either on the radio, on satellite, on podcast. And I think that's pretty consistent, and that's exciting, right? Now, that value added can be something that's a life hacker kind of approach like Ferris has. It can be something that's purely entertaining. And since I also live in the entertainment world, or in the news world a lot of the times I'm just, I'm more likely to turn on Opie, at the end of the day. And the I probably do that. I do subscribe to Anthony's show as well online, and I think that's the diet that we see. But that would, to me, I'll tell you, by the way, that was one of in the experimentation of this was one of the things that when I first started Breitbart TV, and Liz Stevens and I did a live webcast for 4 years, and I've probably done maybe 2,000 hours of live webcasts over the last 7-8 years. And I had that, you've all seen this, which is, in the old days, if you listened to Howard or Opie and Anthony, and you might listen to 18 or 20 minutes in the morning, and that was it, right? And now, you could get back in the car, and you'd hear another different 20 minutes, and then you go out to the store, and you'd hear another 20 minutes, and now you've consumed an hour of that show, whereas in the old model, you would have only been able to hear 20 minutes. Now, I don't think a lot of people are going to go and necessarily download 4 hours of any one of those shows. Maybe their mothers, might. But I had this thing when I was doing my first starting live webcast, and 9 years ago, and I was like, I want to do it long form and unscripted, and I want to play video clips, and I want to make it video and audio. And they said, well, maybe some people will watch live, but it'll probably mainly be on demand and shorter clips later. And I said, well, I'm also just going to loop it 24 hours a day. And the biggest audience was for the looped content, which was just people came, they didn't want to start at the beginning, and they didn't want to just watch this segment over here. They just wanted it on. They liked the show, they liked the banter, they liked the analysis. And that's a lot of where I am on that stuff. If it's serious information, then I'm going to listen to it beginning to end if I've gone through there. If it's something like Serial. And by the way, we were really amazed. We all loved Serial. And then one of the major figures in Serial had something to say and wrote to the Blaze. Right? And so we were able to do the story. And I think people at Serial were like, what? Who is the Blaze? So that's, those are exciting things. But I say it to be like, I think that whether you have whatever your message is, whether it's something that's I'm gonna help you change your life with information or inspiration, or whether I'm just gonna entertain you. I probably don't listen to a lot of. I go to a lot of comedy shows at places like this, but probably a couple of podcasts that I like Bill Burr's show and some others. But give me a reason, right? Give me a reason to listen to your podcast, invest it, and so it better benefit my life in some way. And then, as we all know, as you did an excellent job in the setup, is there has to be a story. There has to be a narrative at any moment, at any time through any of this.
Scott Baker, editor-in-chief of TheBlaze. Thank you, Scott, so much.